You're listening to Hackers to Founders with Chris Magistrado.
I met these folks and I said, this CVE thing would solve a problem we have. And so I took our entire vuln database. Turns out I could drive up the street. We were both in suburbs of Boston. And so I went over to MITRE and I gave them our vuln database on a CD as I remember. And we sat and walked through, this is how we organize our database, this is why we do it. And then I went and told MITRE management, this is a good thing. This is the problem that your customers are having, because MITRE does a lot of work for the government, and some of our customers were in the government. And so I said, yes, let's do this. And said, we can support this. And the we can support this turned out to be the CVE editorial board.
This is Hackers to Founders, a podcast about cybersecurity professionals who have reached the pinnacle of their cybersecurity expertise and have ventured into new frontiers, whether it's launching innovative startups or making impactful investments in our industry. My name is Chris Magistrado, and I'm a vulnerability researcher best known for traveling and meeting hackers from all around the world. And I'm using what little extrovert skills I have to introduce to you hackers that are changing the world. And welcome back to Hackers to Founders. Today we are thrilled to welcome a hacker whose work has fundamentally shaped the way that we think about security design and threat modeling. Adam Shostack is a renowned expert, author, and educator with decades of experience advancing security practices. His groundbreaking contributions include co-creating the CVE, leading Microsoft's threat modeling initiatives, and authoring influential books like Threat Modeling, Designing for Security and Threats, What Every Engineer Should Learn from Star Wars. Beyond his technical expertise, Adam is an entrepreneur who has played pivotal roles in successful startups like NecTech and Zero Knowledge Systems. A sought-after speaker and mentor, he has helped countless organizations and professionals elevate their security strategies. Please join me in welcoming Adam Shostack to Hackers to Founders. Adam, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. And if you're on Spotify, please give us 5 stars. Thanks. Thank you so much for being here. And as you're here, as we're having this lovely moment, I would love to hear more about your childhood. I don't know if you want to go back as deep as possible, but your upbringing, and then we'll kind of get into the cybersecurity aspect as it goes down through your life.
Sure. So, I was a geeky child. I read a lot. I played D&D and war games and Legos. Beautiful. And all the things that your geeky children will do. And in some point, a fellow named Frank Abagnale had a book called Catch Me If You Can. And my mom got a copy of that for me, and it was a pretty exciting book.
Yeah.
It was turned into that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, and I remember reading it when it first came out in hardcover.
Was the book very close to the movie? Because that movie is one of my favorite movies, but I did additional research and I noticed that obviously it's Hollywooded up, but I didn't even know there was a book. So please tell me about the book.
Yeah. So Frank Abagnale is, all of these stories happened 50 plus years ago. And Frank Abagnale has claimed that the book wasn't really the story he told the ghostwriter. Okay. And people can argue about it. I've never personally seen it as a thing to delve into. I've met the man a couple of times. He's always seemed like a charming gentleman. But, how true is it? How true is one to the other?
Yeah. All right. But it had an impact on your childhood, it sounds like, yeah?
It was interesting to me. I remember stories about things like putting Scotch tape over this part of a check or doing this thing to social engineer. And a lot of the techniques that he talks about are still things that you'll see at the social engineering village, you'll still see today. And so I was exposed to them. So I was exposed to them, and also the book is a little bit of a morality play. It sort of ends with him in a nasty prison somewhere and talking about how it wasn't all worth it to do these things. But the idea that you could bypass security systems is one that, it came out, the understanding of how to bypass security was really, really in its infancy. It was closely held knowledge. It was a couple of folks in the military. It was a couple of folks in banks who might have some idea about it. But it was like, okay, here's a mechanism. What do you do to that mechanism? How does it really work? How can you twist the mechanism to your advantage? For example, he talks a lot about check kiting, right? So if you have a physical check and you deposit it at a bank in the 70s on Friday afternoon, odds are it's going to sit in a teller's drawer until Monday, get bundled up on Monday afternoon, get sent to the Federal Reserve System, might make it to the other side of the country on Thursday. Surprise, there's no account there. And there's also no Frank because he's already withdrawn the money on what looked like a good check on a local bank, but the routing number on the bottom sent it across the country. Okay, that's a now obvious, at the time less obvious, sort of hack. And, I didn't go out and start check kiting or anything.
No, we probably have a different story, or I might have to interview you at a different location if it
might have some bars in front of me or a plexiglass wall or something. But that sort of thinking was part of my childhood.
Okay, and it's very interesting. So I like taking Costas' quote, what is it? Every child is an artist, the difficulties remaining an artist. And I feel like every child is inherently a hacker, and the difficulties like remaining a hacker. What are your thoughts on that?
I love it. And so this is not a thing which I talk about a lot in interviews. I tend to talk about more recent stuff, but like I think a lot of the old school hackers, I was not a great student. I had that thing. And I learned about this recently. Really smart people, and I'll put myself at the bottom of that list, but smart people who are good at picking things up often never develop study skills, right? Because it just comes naturally. You understand it, and then you run into a thing that you don't understand, and like, what do I do here? How do I get through this? And this is the thing that I've learned about as I teach, is that if you develop study skills, there are techniques you can use that put stuff into your brain well. And I never learned any of those. So my academic life was a little rocky. And I ended up going to college at 16. I went to a place called Simon's Rock, which was at the time the college for younger scholars. They've changed the tagline and stuff. They're now part of Bard College. But they gave me a phenomenal education, which ties back to what you're saying about the challenge is keeping the artist. They were very focused on developing your ability to reason through writing and using drafting as a tool, and really giving people the space to find things that they found exciting and then develop them through writing a thesis on it, developing the academic knowledge. And I think that experience is so true to the idea that the challenge is keeping the artists as you develop. And my fellow alumni and I will joke that there's a weird typecasting through our community, which is people are doing bizarre stuff. They're doing unusual combinations of how X and Y and Z intercept. And I really think that keeping the artist in the child is such an important part of how we educate and how people become hackers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What were some of the things that you were studying and learning at the time?
So I was actually on my way to a degree in environmental science. So I learned about climate change. I learned about carbon markets. I learned about solar systems. Learned about energy efficiency and recycling. And at some point, I discovered that in 1990, when I was in school, the job market wasn't all that good for these sorts of things.
Okay. What were some of the things that you were experiencing at the job markets in the early 90s with this type of degree?
Yeah, well, I mean, so first off, there were still want ads in the newspaper.
Yeah, right, okay. Right, yeah. I remember I'm young enough to know that they were like I seen them, but I'm also old enough to know that that's not how I'm applying for jobs today or how people apply today.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it was really a lot of word of mouth. And I was lucky enough to have family in the computer business who helped me get my first job. And that first job was as a sysadmin at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. I got to work with an amazing team doing really cool, innovative stuff in surgical planning.
Oh, wow.
And we had computers in the operating room, and they were internet connected in 1990, 91. And so part of my job was the security and privacy of those systems, and that got me into the field.
Okay, very cool. Is this after ARPANET or was that
This is
during the same time?
After ARPANET switched over to TCP/IP.
Okay.
But when I started, we were still manually editing the host's file. I got the lab onto DNS.
Okay, nice. So was the DNS server set up was the router the DNS server, or how did DNS work back then?
You installed bind and you connected it to the YP, then NIS or whatever it was, so that it interconnected to the workstations, and you could use Telnet and FTP and things like that, because this was before Mosaic. I remember we had a Gopher server, we connected to Archie servers, we had Usenet, we had mailing lists.
Was this the operating system, was it Windows or Linux?
Linux didn't exist.
Really? Okay, okay.
It was mostly Sun OS. We had a stack of different Unixes. Linux killed them all eventually.
Okay. There was Unix though. Okay.
It was Unix, yeah. Yeah, kids get off of my lawn, but
no, this is great. I'm enjoying this part.
Windows didn't have a TCP/IP stack. I remember there was I think it might have been a company called FTP Software.
Okay.
Had a third-party TCP/IP stack for Windows 3.1 for the couple of people we had who were Windows users in the research environment.
Okay. Was NT the first one that started utilizing network capabilities, or?
So they had networking capabilities, but they didn't have TCP/IP. They had Novell NetWare, they had Windows for Workgroups, I forget the other stuff.
Okay. Got it. This is it's legacy to the point where I'm like, oh man, I don't. It's hard to comprehend some of this stuff for me. But okay, so it sounds like there was multiple operating systems that you had to manage, as well as like know the ways that all of them communicated, and just getting them to be able to. It sounded like it was potentially difficult. Did you have somebody that was helping you learn these types of things, or did they just say, "Here's the book, kid, like start learning"?
So the Brigham and Women's is part of Harvard. And so I had access to an amazing network of academic systems administrators, and there was a monthly meetup that people would get together.
Nice.
And so there was a community that was available. Also, it's the Boston academic community, so we had lots of MIT students around who had very deep technical knowledge. Not that the Harvard group didn't, but there were lots and lots of folks who had this knowledge, who could say, you want to learn about this thing, I know this person, he'd be happy to answer some emails for you. Also, we had Usenet, we had mailing lists. It was similar to, but a little different than social media today.
Not every 10 seconds is a new reel or something like that, right?
Yeah.
There were mailing lists and boards.
The thing is, in the early days, there were mailing lists like Cypherpunks and the original Firewall list. And so I got to know folks like Steve Bellavin and Bruce Schneier and Marcus Ranum because we would talk on a mailing list. And I was good at writing, I was good at thinking, I was good at thinking things through. And so I got to know these people while the world was a different place. And there's a lot of luck in that timing, right? Today, some of the folks who I've known forever are sort of famous in our world. Others are not. But back then, no one was really famous for being in computing. And
I guess technically it wasn't it's not the behemoth industry that it is today. And you were even in MIT during such a unique time. Were some of those people that you had met, were any of them local to you, or the majority of them you guys met on boards? Okay. Who did you know and meet locally?
So this was in the mid-90s, but I did a stint at BBN, and so I met Mudge and Weld Pond, who worked there, and it was early enough that they were very, very protective of the relationship between their wallet name and their hacker name.
Mm-hmm.
But we also had things like, DEF CON had started by this point. There were 2621 meetings, or 2600 meetings and 2621 meetings. So there were...
What's 2621? I'm familiar with 2600 and DEF CON, but not this other one.
So 2621 was after a 2600 meeting, the people who were 21 or older would go to a bar.
Oh, okay, I got it. Nice.
So there were a lot of teenagers who would show up, and you couldn't go to a bar with them for obvious reasons. So.
Right. Okay. Nice. So, in the early 90s, did you also attend DEF CON at these times as well, or was it no? Yeah.
I think I attended. I know I attended DEF CON 4. Have the T-shirt, but I also have the DEF CON 1 T-shirt, which I bought at DEF CON 4.
Okay,
and
nice.
some people have told me that they remember meeting me at DEF CON 2 or 3.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I was at DEF CON 2 or 3, but I might have been, right? It's 30-ish years ago, and we didn't have blogs. I don't have email archives from that period, so I don't necessarily know that I was there at DEF CON 2 or 3.
It's funny. I don't think things have changed. My first DEF CON was I think 21 or something, and I had usernames, hacker names, mildly some phone numbers, but then after all the years, I've lost so many contacts and people because I've just put their username down or something like that. It's so funny. You're talking 2 decades difference, and the same cultural thing is still there, where it's I lost contact with this person just because. It's probably just because of the nature of the beast of being in security and privacy, I suspect. Yeah.
Yes. And also, you meet people. Actually, I have a sort of funny story.
Yes, please.
A guy who I know, his boss, who I'd known for a long time while I was at Microsoft, said this. I'll just say Chris. I'll say Chris, right? Chris's boss came to me and said, "Hey, Adam, Chris is not having a great time here at Microsoft. Can you sit down with him and help him out a little bit?" I'm like, "Sure, I can do that." And so we get to know each other. We become pretty good friends. And then one day I'm clearing out old emails, and I discover that we had met previously at a ShmooCon.
Oh, wow.
And so I forwarded him the email with his old email address from his previous employer. and said, hey, sorry we lost touch. It would be great to reconnect.
Nice. How is that reconnection? Like, how long have you guys like not spoken? And that was like the time you guys
It'd
were
been like
reconnecting.
5 years.
Oh wow,
And
yeah.
we had totally forgotten the fact that we had met previously and hit it off. Because at the time he was in DC, I was in Seattle. And so we just lost touch. Right. And I think this is one of those realities, is that losing touch feels bad, but it's not. It's usually not a malicious thing if someone's cut you out of their life. It's just, hey, other priorities are standing up. Physical distance, physical distance is a big one.
Yeah. That you bring up a good point. A lot of people though, like, oh, like it's only like I don't want to say the word immature friends, but like when I'm thinking like people back in high school or something, like in the early, like a year after high school or something like this, where they feel like, oh, you haven't contacted me in forever. It's like, I'm sorry, like I'm busy. And then they get upset. Once you start to mature, and I think you grow, and you have a lot more friends and people that you connect with and know, it just increasingly gets more difficult to stay up with people. But it's always those nice, pleasant things when you're at a conference or something and you see somebody that you haven't seen in a long time, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And being upset that you're falling out of touch doesn't help you reconnect. If I reach out to you and I'm like, Chris, why haven't you called me? It's backfooting you. It's putting you on the defensive. And the minute you're on the defensive, you're less likely to want to stick around.
Yeah, that's also true. Yeah, great point. So we're talking about you interacting at 2600, going to your first DEF CON. What was, for the audience, I'm pretty sure we'll have some people that, have been going to DEF CON recently or want to go to DEF CON maybe even. Would love to hear what it was like when it was at the Alexis Park, and then how things have obviously changed a little bit over time.
So it's changed enormously. I mean, when I started going, it was on the order of hundreds of people. And
Wow.
it was at whatever hotel was being torn down that year.
So the Alexis Park was the original one though, right? And then no, it wasn't. So they had moved around, but they eventually settled on the Alexis Park for like a few years?
They settled on Alexis Park for a long time once. So you'll see this occasionally, like the instruction sheets for hotel staff from the early DEF CONs about don't do this, don't do that.
I've seen some of these.
They didn't understand what hackers were, what DEF CON was. It was, in modern terms, it was a hard risk to price, right? How much risk are you taking on? People would go and pick whatever locks they wanted to at a casino, and there were stories about people getting beaten by hotel security. And so the reason DEF CON's in Vegas in the summer is because there was no convention business in Vegas in the summer. And so they were willing to take the convention, and they usually did it as they were tearing down the place, so that pranks like pouring instant cement down the toilet.
Oh my goodness.
Great, guys. That's funny. But also it's a little mythbustery, right? What happens if?
Yeah.
And if you're literally the last person who's ever going to stay in that hotel room before the hotel is torn down. So it was small, I think, is the most important difference. Is an entire DEF CON attendee list could fit in a line today, like a line for a talk.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And so your opportunity to get introduced to people, to have longer conversations was just different today than it can be today.
I've known a few people that, they're creating their own conferences and they're purposely keeping it small, like 1,000 people, if not less, because they want to simulate this type of ability and such. Let's say that some of these conferences do that. Are there other elements like sponsorships and other types of things that they could do or avoid to make it feel more like the original DEF CON?
I don't think you're going to get the same experience in computer security that you could get then today. The world has changed. Computer security is a different thing. There's an industry, right? I remember when firms like Trusted Information Systems and Secure ID started selling internet security technology, like firewalls and authentication tokens. One of the things that made DEF CON interesting was anybody who was interested could show up, and that got a pretty eclectic crowd of people showing up. If you're gonna keep your conference small intentionally, you get the people who are dedicated, and I love the ShmooCon team, don't get me wrong, but you get the people who are dedicated to pressing F12 the minute or the second tickets go on sale at ShmooCon so they can get one.
Right, yeah.
Right.
There's just a massive demand of people that all want to do it, and it changes the adjustments. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So what else was going on? So let's go back to MIT, right, Boston, working at the Harvard area. How did your career progress through there while you were working on the computer equipment? And I guess at that time there was no HIPAA standards, were there?
No.
Okay.
As far as I remember, there were no laws. There were ethical obligations to protect patient privacy that were the primary thing in our mind.
Okay.
So I worked there for 5 years, give or take, and decided that I was really excited by the computer security end of things. Went out, started doing some consulting, did some work for BBN. I'm now allowed to say 25 years later that I did some work for Fidelity. Fidelity, by the way, was insanely advanced.
Really?
They, like, the team that I was working for that brought Fidelity trading onto the internet, I was brought in to help do firewall code reviews, like they were doing AppSec in 1997.
Wow. Oh, no, at the time, what was this language written? Was it C, C++, Java?
Almost all C and C++.
Okay, got it. Wow.
Right. I think we had some Perl. Python didn't exist. Memory safety as a concept didn't exist. Right?
So everything's buffer overflow everywhere.
Yeah. Seriously, we had people who didn't understand why stir copy was a bad thing.
Well, so let's talk about that. This is, as a vulnerability researcher, that's something that, knowing the history of that would be very interesting to speak, with somebody who knows that. It wasn't a thing. So people didn't know, like, maybe one researcher maybe in the world knew it at the time, but like it wasn't like a shared type of thing. Like it wasn't on Frack magazine where people could like say, oh, of course this is a thing.
So we can trace written knowledge about buffer overflows back to a report by John Anderson in 1971 called the Computer Security Study, which he did for the Air Force. And he mentions at some point in there that overwriting blanking on the word they used for the kernel, overwriting something in monitor allowed an attacker to take full control, and it's pretty clearly a buffer overflow of some sort that he's talking about. The knowledge associated with doing that was closely held, right? We know that Robert T. Morris Jr. understood it because he wrote stack smashing overflows in the Morris worm. Fast forward a couple of years, the Zardoz list is hard to get onto, even if you're a sysadmin at a well-known institution. But it wasn't until Aleph 1 published Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit that how to write a buffer overflow became organized, accessible knowledge.
And what time period was this?
Smashing the Stack was 96 or 97.
Okay. Wow. And then you worked at Fidelity at what time?
97.
Okay. So it was at the cusp of it where it was even potentially being discussed while you were doing code review in C++ for the firewalls?
Yep.
Okay, wow. And so like from
And
a
a lot of
oh yeah,
a
please.
lot of the attacks at that time were things like race conditions, right? People writing stuff to /temp, not having, today you've got sticky bits, you've got local private directories, you've got other stuff, but people wrote stuff to temp. That was more a logged in user, right? A student logged into the big shared Unix machine in the data center could become root by taking advantage of something like that. Those were the more common vulns at that point. It was when Aleph published Smashing the Stack that we saw the first rise of remote buffer overflow sorts of things. And a lot around that time, the first vuln scanners started to get written. So Detect, ISS, Ballista all started to create vuln scanners, and I ended up joining Detect as a startup, building a vuln scanner, and that was when I met Steve Christie and Dave Mann, who at a conference on vuln databases, and they had this paper titled something like Towards a Common Vulnerability List, and that became the CVE.
Wow. Okay, I want to dive into the story of the CVE and how this was developed. But before we do, is it that you joined this company that was creating this vulnerability scanner, or did you create this company that built out this vulnerability scanner?
I joined. It was created by some folks in Israel, and they found me through a venture capitalist who I knew and recruited me in with dreams of making vast fortunes.
Okay. All right.
That
how many
has not changed. There's a lot more information available to people joining startups today than there was in '97. But anyway, keep going.
No, let's talk about that, because I mean, this entrepreneur business podcast. So, what were some of the differences that actually, let me digest everything. So, like, you were introduced to them by a venture capitalist. How did the venture capitalist and you connect and learn each other? And then two, what the hell was venture capitalism like at that time in the United States and even in Israel?
So I don't remember exactly how we connected.
Okay, that's fine.
But at the time, there was a lot less information available. The idea that you do a seed round, then an A round, then a B round was way less standardized. The number of firms was way smaller. And the people who were venture capitalists tended to not be MBAs, but they tended to be people who had succeeded and actually done it.
Interesting. Okay, yeah.
And the way you spent your money was different. We bought servers and put them in a closet in our office, burned CDs and shipped them to customers. And so the cost of building and running the business was way higher because you had to go out and buy $10,000 servers for everything instead of renting them from Amazon for a few bucks an hour.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say. Like, the reason why Amazon has pushed out for the startups so much and has helped develop it was because of that. Like, Uber's infrastructure wouldn't have been able to bid up so quickly if it wasn't because of that. And Netflix actually crashed their first day of launch because they didn't have servers. They had to go run and buy some from the store, and then once they set that up, it only lasted another 45 minutes, then it crashed again. And then you're even talking about the distributions of sending through CDs through mail. So it's the entire cost to just develop a tech company back during this time was a very expensive relative. And you didn't even know if the idea was valuable because it was hard to determine if the market fit was there as quickly as you can today, even with a POC, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Cost of selling was higher, cost of marketing was higher, right? You couldn't just go and buy ads. I remember going to trade shows, and that was how you found leads, and we worked the bejesus out of those leads.
Yeah, so I'd like to hear about that, because you're going to these trade shows. And at the time you were selling the vulnerability scanner. Is that correct?
Yep, Hacker Shield was the product name.
Hacker Shield. So you're selling Hacker Shield, but I mean, at that time, well, not too many people even know about security. Are you having to be like, hey, by the way, there's a boogie there? I don't want to say it, but like, things could go bad. You should take a look at this. And like, what was that conversation like? I've so many years as the hacker, I've always like been terrified of like sales and security because I feel it can be malicious. But I wanted to know how you guys felt and how you guys went about selling the security product. Did it always feel like intrinsically positive, or was there ever some time of like it's snake oil? I guess it doesn't feel like snake oil. It wouldn't be because you're selling it, but
I mean, we were selling on fear.
Yeah.
Right? We were selling on the fear of getting broken into, but we had to explain to people how that might work.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they didn't understand that there were vulnerabilities that people could scan for and just take advantage of. And they didn't understand that there were security updates available, right? This is before Patch Tuesday. This is before Windows Update. So it was, and this was the era when there was a lot of debate over vulnerability disclosure, right? Are people better off having vulns disclosed, not? This was the time that a guy at Microsoft called vulnerability researchers terrorists.
Was this largely because the vulnerabilities that they were discovering were inside of Microsoft or something?
Microsoft didn't like the fact that vulnerability disclosure was hurting their customers as a way of pressuring Microsoft to change.
Oh man, at the company that was built on reverse engineering other products is upset about people reverse engineering their own stuff and discovering vulnerabilities. Interesting. Oh. Okay, so were people getting prosecuted for discovering vulnerabilities and talking about it during this time? I know that there's those famous DEF CON talks where people are like literally pulled off stage. Was that also true to what Microsoft and other companies like Cisco were doing?
There was definitely concern that you could be sued. Like when I found some vulns in what's now the RSA token, was then the Secure ID token. And they had a reputation for litigating. And so when I found this, someone said, you should get a lawyer.
My goodness.
And so I went and I got a lawyer to review the paper I had written. And I spent a couple of $1,000s on legal fees before I published it, because getting sued was a real concern.
So let me ask you this, because like from a so why did you publish it? Was it like a business type of thinking that like, if I publish this, it'll help reputation so I can potentially build something? Or was it altruistic and we're like, I want to share with the community that there's these things that are involved to pressure companies to do better? Or what were some of your thoughts and feelings while you were going through this entire financial process?
So I think, one, I wanted it fixed. Okay, now that you asked the question, I had been doing some contracting work managing a company's secure ID tokens, and their software was frustratingly bad.
Okay. You're right.
And so I think my primary motive was probably to get back at the company a little bit, because I was so frustrated with their products, by pointing out a flaw in this key thing. I don't think at that point, this was the time, God, what was, Eric Bloodaxe had a shirt someone had a shirt at one of the DEF CONs that said, Eric Bloodaxe, I only hack for money.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a derogatory sort of accusation to be making. I mean, the career that you have of doing vuln research not only didn't exist, but so didn't exist that one of the guys who worked for me, who we found through either ADM or Woo Woo, his mom called me because she thought it was a front for the mafia and wanted to understand how the heck we were making money doing this thing that her son did, because she was worried he was going to go to jail.
So how was he making the money when in a world where vulnerabilities weren't actively making people rich like bug bounty programs do today?
So we were hiring people to do vuln research to improve our scanner, find problems, market the problems. But yeah, there were no bug bounties. And so it was a salary, right? It was just he could get paid for finding vulns because it helped us improve our product. And that was a new and different thing.
Okay, a few questions about the company and that you guys are selling to. Were you guys going like enterprise,
Totally
like
enterprise.
Okay, not even worrying about the users, the end users, or okay, going full enterprise. And what were some of these like contracts like in terms of like the size of the point, like the revenue that you guys received, and it was like subscription? Like, how did all of that work?
It was a license fee. It wasn't. No one had subscription products back then.
Okay.
I don't remember the size of the contracts.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, beautiful. And then, so let's go. I'd like to move over to learn more about like how you created the CVE.
So I met Dave and Steve, and we had a problem, which is that we knew our competitors. Frankly, we said they were cheating by counting things repeatedly. Whether or not they were cheating, we don't actually know, because before there were CVE, how do you know if this PHP vuln and that PHP vuln are the same vuln?
Oh, so there was no identification for specific types of vulnerabilities, so they would just like double, triple count for certain ones,
or maybe they really were counting for different. Maybe they really were counting for different things, right? I don't want to accuse anyone of intentionally cheating, but let's say you and I are both vuln researchers working for Company X.
Okay.
And you find a PHP vuln that's out there on BugTrack, and I find a PHP vuln that's out there on Full Disclosure, and we both write checks for it. And it turns out to be the same vuln, what we would now call the same CVE.
What you mentioned two different things, two pronouns I'm not familiar with. I write it for one place and you write it for another place. What are those repos, or what are those places?
So BugTrack and Full Disclosure were mail lists that people would send vulns to.
Okay.
And they'd often send proof of concept code. And so we might each discover a vuln and put it into our product. And maybe we'd be doing that honestly, and maybe we'd just be ballooning our count, because how do you evaluate a vuln scanner? It's how many things come back.
Got it. Oh, see. So I would say like, oh, we find 3,000 vulnerabilities, and you guys say like, oh, well, we found 5,000.
Exactly.
And there's no way to determine like the actual validity or what types of vulnerabilities are being searched for, and anything of that matter, because there's no associated identification with those vulnerabilities. Is that correct?
Exactly. I met these folks and I said, this CVE thing would solve a problem we have. And so I took our entire vuln database. Turns out I could drive up the street. We were both in suburbs of Boston. And so I went over to MITRE and I gave them our vuln database on a CD, as I remember. And we sat and walked through, this is how we organize our database, this is why we do it. And then I went and told MITRE management, this is a good thing. This is the problem that your customers are having, because MITRE does a lot of work for the government, and some of our customers were in the government. And so I said, yes, let's do this. And said, we can support this. And the we can support this turned out to be the CVE editorial board, which in the early days used to actually vote on every CVE candidate.
Is that not how it works now?
Today there's no voting, and I'm no longer operationally involved with CVE, and I haven't been in a long time. But My understanding is that today there's these candidate numbering authorities who are authorized to release CVEs when they feel it's the right thing to do.
Okay. I see. Okay. All right. So how did you know to go to Meter through this type of thing, and that potentially they would work and support this?
So Dave and Steve worked at MITRE.
Oh, okay. Got it.
And they had started the project and were looking, and myself, Andre Fresh, a couple of other people, Andre was at ISS at the time, said this is useful. People like Gene Spaff said this is useful to me as an academic. And people were saying, yes, this is a useful thing. And then along the way, MITRE briefed Tony Sager, who was at the National Security Agency, and Tony said, yes, this is a thing that the Defense Department could make good use of, and funded it. And then as it grew, I remember I ran into Dave somewhere and he said, Adam, I saw someone's resume and it lists being on the CVE advisory board. That's so weird. Because at the time, it was people who cared about vulns, and the CVE was not a big thing in the early years, right? It was
Right.
People used bug track identifiers. ISS pushed for a long time for people to use X-Force identifiers. There were lots of different identifiers you could use, and CVE gave you a way to work between them. And it took I couldn't say how long, but it took years before CVE became accepted as a primary identifier.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's so interesting. So all these other companies had their own internal ones, and then you were able to create the system with MITRE to be able to centralize it, but like make it one type of authority where everyone could just submit directly there. So that's interesting. So then I guess later in the process for the products, for these vulnerability scanners, would they use, like, we have this many CVEs that we look at, and that was like kind of like the standard going forward?
Yes.
Okay. And then for these scanners, like, what, I mean, it scans for certain types of vulnerabilities. So I'm trying to ask this, like, were there a lot of different products that were utilized with your guys' scanner, or did you guys like focus on specific type of products, or were there like not that many products that you could easily do a bunch of them with a universal scanner?
So it was more the universal scanner, right? It was what is now the Qualys, the Rapid7 sorts of scanners that will scan everything they can find. And over time, people sort of gravitated towards the stuff that had CVEs because those things became actionable, because you could go and find a patch for them.
Okay, so the patches were then set up. So actually, so Mitra would also create like a page or something that's like, oh, if you have this vulnerability, you need to have this type of patch. Is that correct? Or was it up to the person to figure out and like connect the dots of like, oh, we have this CVE, we need to contact like, a bunch of people to figure out if anyone has this patch?
So that was the thing that vuln scanners would do for you, right? One of the things that the people who worked for me at the time were responsible for was creating a check, and the things that went into a check included, how do you find the problem? What do you tell the customer about it? What URLs do you give them to say, here's the update that you should go apply? And one of the things we focused on at Netect was, how do you make that as easy and comprehensible for the sysadmin user as possible? They shouldn't have to go and search on the CVE to figure out what to do about it. We'll give you that information in a consistent form so that you spend your time doing the work you need to do.
I got it. And then how did your career mature after that point?
So we sold Netect in 1999.
Who did you sell it to?
A company called BindView that made netware management systems.
And what did that acquisition look like, and how old were you at the time, and how did they reach you for the acquisition? How did all that happen?
Well, I mean, so I wasn't in the very small set of people who were in the acquisition conversations. Heard about it one day.
Okay, but did you have equity in the company as well,
Yeah.
or shares and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay.
But again, at the time, like today, there's levels.fyi, there's sites that will tell you this much equity at a valuation of that will probably be worth this to you.
Right. Okay.
That information was not available, right? Understanding about things like preferences and liquidation was not available. And so my expectations and my reality did not line up at all. And so I was disappointed and frustrated. And I said, the heck with this. And I went to join another startup called Zero Knowledge Systems that was doing things like Tor before there was a Tor.
Okay, let's break down that as much as possible on a technical side if we can as well.
Sure.
So what were you guys doing to basically create this anonymized network?
We built a product that gave you anonymous internet browsing, anonymous email, some other things, and it had layers of routers, and there were designs for these sorts of things, right? Paul Syverson had published his onion routing stuff. Lance Cottrell had done work on a router called Mixmaster. That was an email router that was asynchronous rather than synchronous, so it wasn't real-time browsing. And we brought together a lot of the people who had built such things, and we built a product, and we were selling it. Explaining to the market the difference between us and a one-hop router and why IP-level privacy mattered was really hard.
Yeah, how did that conversation go?
Essentially, we would get really excited because surveys indicated privacy was important, and we were selling a privacy thing, but we never sold all that much of it, right? There were people that we would run into who would literally want to hand me cash and believe that I would send them a box with the product in it later, which I did for the several people who gave me cash at conferences and their PO box because they didn't want to use a credit card so that the credit card couldn't be associated with their name.
Right. Okay. So, in the majority of the customers or clients that you were working with, they were largely from security conferences. So these are people that are already privacy aware instead of Joe Schmo on the street.
Okay. We had some government customers. We had some investigator types who wanted to be able to browse the web without being tracked. It was early. One of the things about being an entrepreneur is that it is really hard to time the market. The team at Tor has spent 20 years now building and refining what they're doing, and they've got dedicated users, they've got enthusiasts and fans, but it's not mainstream.
Yeah, correct. I mean, well, another interesting thing that you mentioned is every person said that they wanted a privacy that you spoke to, but then the question is do you want to pay for it? And it sounded like more people want the privacy, expect the privacy, but if they maybe have to pay for it, then they're kind of well, does that sound accurate? Whether it be at that time or now?
I think the thing is what people mean by privacy and what problems they're worried about can be very varied. So, for example, we all have curtains on our windows because we have all walked by someone's home and looked in, right? The meaning of privacy there is really jumps out in our mind because of whatever we see through someone else's window. So people pay for privacy there because they understand the threat and they understand the solution.
Got it. So that makes a lot of sense. They're not actively saying that ISPs or governments are knowing everything that they look at in their websites because it's not blatantly seen every day, literally walking down the street as opposed to these curtains.
Exactly. And also you can make curtains aesthetically pleasing. You can't make making web browsing slower aesthetically pleasing.
Exactly, and that's where our company, Top Cleared Recruiting, comes in. Finding the right cybersecurity talent with the necessary clearances can be a major hurdle. Did you know that it could take 8 to 15 months on average to hire somebody with a TS SEI plus full polyscope? At Top Cleared Recruiting, we have a network of 1.3 million cleared professionals, ranging from C&O developers, reverse engineers, and data scientists. Whether you're working on offensive operations or data analysis, we connect you with the elite talent you need fast. Visit topclearrecruiting.com and let us help you to find the perfect candidate, already cleared and ready to go. No,
Right.
pleasing in any type of way, generally, yeah.
And so you've got to work at maintaining your privacy. And so I think that makes it harder to sell some of the privacy techniques. And I think in the last 10 years, maybe more, there's a sense of inevitability to some of these things, right? It's so hard to successfully protect yourself. Why even bother trying?
Yeah, yeah. It really has extended out to be like that. In terms of the company that you guys were working on and this anonymized surfing platform, were you able to like surf? Is it, how do I want to ask this? Is it similar to like a VPN service where like the website knows that you're coming from one IP address, but it's like masked, or like how did the other websites determine and see the traffic that was received to their servers?
It was actually very similar to Tor.
Okay.
Right. So there were multiple layers of proxy. And in fact, we sat down with Roger and Nick and some of my team when we shut that down and shared with them some lessons learned. And I don't want to take any credit for the amazing work that they've done, but there really is visible. If you understand how Tor works, you understand how the product we were building should have worked. Some of what we did made things more complicated because we had an authorization system and an account system that we needed for a commercial service, which they don't need for a community operated service. And so their product is simpler in some ways, better in many other ways. But if you understand Tor, you understand what we were doing.
And then how did your career and life progress after that? So after you guys got together, had the discussion, what was the next move for Adam?
So I founded a startup based on some work that I had done. That startup didn't go very well. I said I needed a more stable job. I spent some time talking to a lot of different people. I got invited to Microsoft's new Blue Hat conference, started talking to some of the folks there. And as we were talking, and they said, well, what would you do about this? And I had an answer for them. They said, okay, assume that you had tried that and this happened. And I realized that since we didn't have an NDA in place, they weren't saying, yeah, we tried this happened. But that's what they were telling me. And it turns out that of all the conversations I had about my next job, this one seemed the most challenging. And so I took it, even though it was Microsoft, and I did not have high regard for Microsoft at the time. In fact, I joined Microsoft, and I had been planning to go to an academic conference a week or two after I ended up starting. And so on my little badge, I had crossed off whatever my company name had been and wrote Microsoft on it. And people came up and laughed. And I'm like, no, actually, I'm serious. I've taken the job at Microsoft.
Yeah.
And I thought I was only going to stay 2 years, right? Get my feet back under me. And at the end of 2 years, I was having such a good time and getting to work on such interesting problems that I'm like, the only reason I would leave is because I don't like the Microsoft brand, and that's not a good reason to leave.
Interesting.
So
So you were excited with the projects and the challenges that they were presenting to you to the point where like it was so fulfilling. Is that correct?
yeah, I mean, I was on the secure development lifecycle team. I was working with folks like Mike Howard and Steve Lipner, and I was the threat modeling owner. I owned a bunch of other things on that team as well, but threat modeling is the one that we talked most about in public.
I'd like
And
to hear more about the threat modeling and like how that even came to be, and then what was the like how did the community and the world see it at the time? Because like today you can't think of doing anything, even just like threat modeling itself as a concept. If you're talking about security, and I used to counsel and give a lot of people advice because like sometimes I'm the only security guy in the room, and some people will be like, how do I prevent this type of attack, or like how do I get this? And it's like, what's your threat model? Who's actually going to come after you? Is it these types of people, like your neighbors, local government, federal government, international government? Like, what is your issue? Because like it highly depends on that. You don't need to go this level if you're doing these kinds of things or whatever the case is. So, yeah, please.
sorry, there's a lot there. Let me think about it for a sec. 1999 or so, Lauren Confelder and Prerit Garg invented this thing called STRIDE. STRIDE's a mnemonic for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. They used it to model threats, to ask the question that we now say, what could go wrong? And they started to scale that out. So instead of asking who's going to attack me, which who knows who's going to attack you, but you know your product. So you can say, if I've got a sketch of my product, a whiteboard level thing, I can ask what can go wrong. I can use Stride to do that analysis. And they started doing that just at whiteboards, taking notes in Notepad, and it was really highly effective. And then they would be like, okay, you guys got this? Product team would say, yep, we got this. And then they'd go and try and do it themselves, and sometimes it would work and sometimes it didn't. So they started building more and more formalisms to try and help people do the work. And by the time I joined in 2006, the process had gotten bureaucratic, confusing, ineffective. And so we really wanted to build automation. We really wanted to scale, right? One of the first things I learned is I couldn't even take meetings with all of the people in Windows who wanted to talk about threat modeling.
Wow.
That's Windows, never mind Office, Xbox, all the other products that Microsoft ships.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to build processes. We had to build techniques that we could learn and teach. We built software. I built a version of a threat modeling tool that was simpler than the previous tools. We spent a fair amount of time on usability for it. And so we built that, we delivered it, it was used in Win 7. Time went by, and I said, I don't want to be ironic here, I don't want to be the threat modeling guy for Microsoft. I'd like it to be a skill that our team has and that we can bring many people into. So I did some other things for that team. Along the way, I helped to fix auto-run. And then other people were doing this work. I didn't love how they were doing it, and I realized that writing a book was the shortest, easiest way to explain what I had learned. Writing a book is never the simplest, easiest way to do anything, except when it is.
Okay, all right. Yeah. How long did it take you to write the book?
There were a couple of chunks, right? There was a version that I had written in like 2007, 2008 that was never published. That was like, I shared it with people internally so that they could do some things. And then eventually I got a contract with Wiley, and I spent another couple of years rewriting it. I thought I had a decent draft, and I sort of didn't. but that's okay. The final product was worth the writing and the rewriting. And then around 2014, a year after the book came out, I decided that my time at Microsoft had come to an end. I went out, I was going to build another product. People started calling me and saying, hey, can you help us threat model? And I said, well, I get this other idea. I don't really want to. And then eventually, I realized something very important. And I hope your audience is ready for some entrepreneurial wisdom. Write this down. I decided to do what people were calling me and asking me to do. Which sounds really obvious, but I had a different plan, and I wasn't taking as much market feedback as I should have on that plan. And so I switched over to threat modeling full time in about 2015, 2016. Since then, the business has evolved to be mostly focused on training. I think training is the highest scalability thing that I can do. I routinely run into former students who are like, yep, I took your course 5 years ago. Let me tell you, it's going great. I had one which was sort of funny. I'm not going to name names here, but the guy said, yeah, I took your course in like 2016 and I've taken all of your materials and we're using it to train new people at my new company and it's going swimmingly. And I'm like, on the one hand, that's lovely. On the other hand, that's my intellectual property that you're not paying for. That I have a business to do this training. But okay, I'll take the win for a win.
Interesting. So let me ask you this: like, when they came to you saying, like, "Can you teach us?" Like, sounds like you were making some type of money from it in revenue. How did you know what to charge?
So I didn't. I picked numbers that people paid very quickly, and I should have taken that as a sign that I was underselling myself. And then a friend of mine said, "We hire people who train at Black Hat." And Black Hat sets a price for us per seat. And so, you go to Black Hat's website and my training there sells for like $4,200 a seat.
Yeah. Right.
And so at the top of the market, you want to learn from the person who wrote the book. We charge a little bit less than that since we don't have to give Black Hat a cut. But that's how we base our pricing.
Excellent. So then, would you go into like companies and say like, okay, I'll train your guys' company for like this amount of much, or like, was it individual people that you'd be like, okay, I'll teach you how to do this, and then, I mean, regrettably, it sounded like that guy just went to go teach the entire team.
I mean, he did. I do take it as a win, right? I'm proud that the people I teach can go out and teach, and yes, I'll be honest with you, I would like their money. But I don't want them.
Very good, yeah.
But I don't want their money so much that I'm going to be a jerk about it, right? If you learn,
right.
Like I'll tell this story. One guy took my training, the slide book, redid it by like copying my slides into his and making occasional changes. And then he put it up there on GitHub. And he sent it to me and I was like, dude, I have spent literally years developing and redeveloping and improving the slides so that they're more clear. I listen to my students. They tell me this is confusing. I improve those slides. And so I reached out to him and I said, that's way too close to what we've done. Can you please take it down? And he did. I find, look, it is wonderful when a student is enthusiastic and wants to share what they've learned. I have no problem with that, right? You can go, you buy my books, you read them, you write your own training course, you sell it. I have no problem with that. My problem is you take the thing that I created and you photocopy it and then you sell it.
Right. There's no additional work or enhancements or whatever the hell that they would potentially do. Is that it?
Yeah. I know people who have written their own threat modeling courses Cool. Good for you. I got no problem with people taking the ideas and turning it into a thing. It's the training thing, which I am proud of, right? We spend a lot of time and energy making a great training product. And to answer your question, we get the thing I started with is a company would call me up and say, come do a class for a couple of days. And I would get on an airplane, I would go, I would do the class, I would teach people, I'd leave them their slide books and the other stuff that you give them. And when the pandemic rolled around, I had to figure out what it was that I was doing because I couldn't fly there and do things in a room with them. And so I spent months learning about learning how to create useful content. I bought fancy cameras and lights and a teleprompter and learned how to do that. And so now we've got things like a self-paced version of the course. And actually, this morning, a fellow posted a very nice thing on LinkedIn about, I'm excited by what he said. So I'm going to read you a couple
Please share.
of words. He says, a big thank you to Adam Shostack and the team at Shostack & Associates for putting together such a well-structured and insightful course, and Team Zeiss for supporting my journey to deepen my threat modeling skills and knowledge. And then he's got more than a page. This course highlighted how structured, practical, and invaluable threat modeling is for designing secure systems. Thank you for breaking down such a crucial topic. And, that's really nice to hear, right? I really appreciate that he not only said those kind words, but he said them in public so I can quote them to you. No, and look, this is general advice. If there's an author, an artist, someone whose work touches you, take a minute, say nice things to them. Say, I appreciate your work. It makes a difference. Everyone has good days, everyone has bad days. Taking a minute to tell people that their work matters to you makes the world a better place. So anyway, so now we help a lot of organizations with this sort of training. And we do some of it with conferences. I mentioned Black Hat. We do OWASP. We're going to do DEF CON training this year. And all of it is how do we help people with this skill, which is so important. And there are so many ways in which it goes wrong for folks because of these things that people think of. And I'm going to say this, I don't mean to rake you over the coals as I say it, but you said, who's going to attack me? Right? That's a totally normal way to think about the questions of what can go wrong is who's going to do this and what can they do? And if you've got a background, say, in threat hunting or threat intel, you get really focused on, we've got this concrete information about who attackers are and how they work, and we can bring that to bear. Ain't that awesome? Sometimes it's awesome, but sometimes you get it wrong, right? And starting from who's going to attack us has two unforced errors that are really important. One is you're wrong about who the attacker is going to be. And two, you're wrong about what they're going to do. So I like to use something like stride or a kill chain and an abstracted kill chain rather than this is what Salt Typhoon did to these people last week, but more delivery, exploit, installation, act on objectives, right? How do I deliver an attack to this system? I like to use those sorts of techniques to help us through the question of what can go wrong, because we can answer that with less specialized knowledge about attackers and still get to an important set of results for our system.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned the way that you love helping people and the development of the threat modeling curriculum and how you share that with organizations and people and how they grow from it. Do you have any additional things that you've shared and have helped with your work with Mach 37, the Cyber Accelerator, because I know you've worked there for some time as well. So I'd love to hear some stories about how, you've worked with other entrepreneurs or people in that area.
Sure. But before I go there, I realize I commented a little bit about intellectual property, and I want to mention I
Yes, please.
try to give lots of stuff away as well. So, for example, I created the 4-question framework for threat modeling of what are we working on, what can go wrong, what are we going to do about it, did we do a good job? Totally free. Please quote the questions. And I talk about the questions in a new white paper, which is also completely free, right? So we do give away, we Shostack and Associates give away a lot of what we do, and I try and find a balance between running a business and helping people do these sorts of things. On the entrepreneurial side, with Mach 37 and elsewhere, I'm doing a little bit less these days, but I absolutely, the call I had right before ours was with someone. I'm on their advisory board. They're raising a new round of funding. And a lot of what I try and do is share the benefit of experience around how do you build a business that succeeds? One company that I'm talking to, how do I explain this story in a way that respects their privacy? So they went through, they did some analysis of their sales pipeline, and they said, we lost $1 million in business because we don't have features that do X.
So let me before we jump into the sales pipeline and that part, is it a product or service based company?
Yes, it is.
Okay, got it.
But
okay, all right, yeah.
But
I thought as much.
Yeah, I want to be respectful of privacy of people when I talk about this, because
of course I understand completely. That's fine. If you're mentioning features, I can only imagine it's a product. But if you're talking about features in a service base, then I'd be confused. So I don't think it gave anything away, and we won't go too deep into it.
Totally fair.
Okay.
Totally fair. And so they said, we built this feature to meet this need. And I looked at it and I'm like, does that feature really meet this need? Or is this a feature, and we were actually talking about this with Zero Knowledge, right? Okay, your customers are saying privacy, you're saying privacy, but is your feature going to meet their need? And I think my answer was no, it doesn't really meet the need in the way you hope it does. Look, I'm not a sales pipeline management sort of person. But I think in today's world, there are so many people who are offering advice to startups that the advice that founders get is put your advisors into a box. You're a CTO advisor, you're a sales advisor, you're a go-to-market advisor, you're a cloud scalability advisor. And as long as you understand the problems that you have, that's great. But I think one of the things that I see with the professionalization of venture capital, the standardization of these models, we get a lot of people who are building very similar things. And as long as your problems fall into the sorts of problems that other people have seen, you can get through them, right? If you're building a new advertising system, okay, you're going to have some standard problems. 10 years ago, we saw a lot more diversity in the security marketplace, and now it's getting standardized, right? Things are getting commoditized. We're into much more mass market sort of products. And so the need for people who can be generalist on occasion is a little bit lower. And so I'm doing a little bit less of the advising work than I used to, because people come to me with very specific asks that I don't think are the sort of advice that I can most usefully offer. And so I just do less of it.
Okay, got it. So for let's say let's flip the script and let's say that you could have your ideal startup come to you and then you're like, of course I can help this type of problem. I'm great at it. What is the type of startup or product or service that could come to you that you'd be able to help them and willing to and it'd be a good fit?
It's a great question and not one I spend a lot of energy on.
Okay.
Look, there are these pipelines now. Y Combinator, Mach 37 has one. There are industry accelerators, there are geographic accelerators. People are strongly encouraged to solve problems in very specific ways. And the advisor communities that support them end up being specialized, right? You find your advisors from the Y Combinator alumni. You find your advisors from the Mach 37 alumni. And it's been 20-ish years since I've been at a startup. And so the way I find my startups is people I know who are starting companies come to me and say, can you help? Rather than me going out and trying to find deal flow and building that portfolio in a intentional way.
Right. So it's usually people within your own network reaching out to you saying like, "Hey Adam, this is what I want to do. What do you think?" kind of thing over like a coffee or a beer.
Yep.
So we're
Yeah, and some of them I'm on their advisory board, some of them I invest in. But I think at this point it's mostly my network that I'm finding people that I do that with.
okay, excellent. And then let's say, how has been your experiences going through your company and everything else that's happening in your world right now? And then what are some things in the future that you hope to develop coming up this next year and the next few years to come?
That's a fun one. So one of the things, and we haven't really talked about this, one of the things that I've done that I think I'm particularly good at is taking ideas that have been talked about for a while and making them concrete and real. So I did this with threat modeling. Threat modeling was a skill set that people talked about. It was a thing we did. There's certainly people who were threat modeling before I was. What I did was I made it accessible to a wider set of folks. With Rob Kanaki and Tara Wheeler, we did some work on an idea of an NTSB for security. And this idea had been floating around since 1991. And Rob was at the Belfer Center at Harvard, and he and I knew each other. And he said, let's do this, because he knew this was an interest of mine. We convened a workshop. We wrote up a 100-page report on what does an NTSB for security mean. And as we were writing this, some folks at the White House were working on an executive order, and Rob brought the report to them, and that led to the creation of the Cyber Safety Review Board. I'm doing similar work today where we're taking the ideas of public health, measuring populations, measuring the harmful outcomes, and with a nonprofit called Cyber Green, we're creating a discipline of cyber public health. And so Google gave us a little bit of money. We held a workshop last year in January, or this year, earlier this year. We have a workshop report that we did, and we're doing additional things that will be coming out over the next few months to help create this discipline and go beyond just using metaphors like computer viruses or cyber hygiene and saying one of the crucial things that happens in the world of public health is we measure things based on the public, some population. And that requires knowing what the population is. So one of the research streams that we're engaged in is asking, what does a population look like? Is it devices? Is it accounts? How do we think about populations in the cloud, where there are things like virtual machine stores? Or what's the relationship of a Terraform file to an individual, whatever an individual might be, because if we know that, then we could ask, is the rate of infection per 100,000 Windows machines going up or going down? Is the rate of account takeovers per million Gmail accounts going up or down?
Interesting. So having a standardized amount to determine the growth or decline of different types of, is it threats in the wild, or is it?
I don't care about threats. What I care about is impacts.
The impact. Okay.
Right. And in the world of public health,
Right.
for example, we might measure the rate of COVID in wastewater, because that tells us something about the prevalence of the disease in the population, right? If wastewater levels are down, odds are the disease is down. But what we really care about is how many people get sick, how many people are hospitalized, how many people have a chronic condition. And we use the wastewater numbers as a somewhat leading predictor, right? The wastewater numbers will change before hospitalization levels do.
Right. Okay.
Right. So maybe the amount of phishing emails in a phishing trap are a predictive indicator in that way. But what I really care about is how much money is stolen from people's bank accounts at the end of the day.
Right. Okay. How would it be possible to get this information and such? Would it be working with these companies that would publicly, well, not publicly, I guess privately disclose that level of information? And then is the research then public later, or is it like obfuscated in some type of way? Like how? I don't understand entirely. I'm sorry.
These are great questions, and this is what makes it research.
Yeah. Okay.
So, for example, one source of this data might be mandatory breach disclosure reporting, right? We can learn about some of it that way. I saw some work by some folks at the UC San Diego a couple of weeks ago who realized that they can detect hospital ransomware because when you get a ransomware incident, the first thing you do is you shut off your internet connection. And it turns out that hospitals have these cloud endpoints for things like electronic medical records transfer. And so they built a scanner that connects to these things, and they can detect when a hospital is going offline.
That's brilliant. So then if they determine that it's offline, then they can analyze that it's been probably hit with the ransomware.
There's a lot of nuance and subtlety, but essentially.
Essentially, yes. Okay. Does this also work with other types of industries or areas, or hospitals would probably be the
So they're doing some work that's funded by a science agency, and they have starting with hospitals because that is what matters to their sponsor.
Okay.
And yes, I asked exactly the same question, and Stephen Savage said, we're working on it.
Very cool. Very interesting.
So we can get clever with how we do this. The forthcoming thing, and a thing that I want to encourage your audience to think about, is how can I take tools and techniques from another field, like public health, and bring them to my work. People solve problems by reasoning, by analogy, and getting really concrete about where does that analogy take me is something that I found to be a repeated source of success and impact in my career.
Right. So basically, or as I believe you're saying, take your expertise and understanding in one area or industry and then bring it over to see if that type of solution cannot solve problems in adjacent or other types of areas. Is that sounding pretty accurate?
Precisely.
Okay. Yeah. I've noted there's been a few times I've done other types of work outside of primarily cybersecurity, and the things that I've seen, no I'll speak to the majority of the people that I would be in the room with or whatever, and I have the most security background. But the way that I handle and see the problems is so significantly different than the others. And I'll see them doing different types of like operations that are just like, you could virtualize this and would like solve so much of your problems and stuff like that, when they're not technical enough to be able to do it themselves, and nor is anyone providing different types of solutions for those. So it's very interesting because you look at adjacent types of areas and think like, this can be applied here, but it takes that level, that person that understands and can look at it from a different lens to come by and say, hey, I see that we're all here and everyone's doing this. Has anyone considered something else? And like, if not, why not, kind of thing.
And just to build on what you're saying, a lot of people talk about diversity as a moral imperative. I think diversity is a business imperative because of exactly what you just said. If you bring in people who come from a variety of different backgrounds, who have different life experience, who have different ages, grow up in different parts of the world, you naturally create a situation which reduces that groupthink and increases the likelihood that someone in the room has an experience that they can contribute that other people don't have.
That's true. That's true. Excellent. So where do you see yourself working with this project and everything else as it continues down the line?
So I think this is going to be an important part of my legacy. I think that the opportunity to solve, I think that the way public health, I think this is going to be an important part of my legacy. I think the way public health has effectively solved problems for the world is really valuable. They've developed techniques that help them solve the problems that matter most. And I'll give you a specific example. We did some work, and this is at cybergreen.net/research. You can take a look, on a tool called the health belief model. And the health belief model is all about why don't people do the things doctors tell them to do. And they don't do those things because they're worried about cost, they're worried about pain, they're worried about they don't believe the problem will really impact them. And we did some work. We did an interview study. We dug into log. And it turns out that one of the things that inhibited people from getting work done around Log4j was the amount of people talking about it to cue action in various ways. There were so many people saying, oh my God, have you seen this thing? That they literally had to spend time figuring out which ones they'd seen and which ones they hadn't. Going back a little bit to the CVE problem, but more importantly, thinking about we're spending all of this energy on cues to action. We're not spending as much on making it easy to find where is this in my environment. I know I should do something. Help me do that something. Help me think about how do I deal with this relative to the fact that the business around me, and one of the things I heard that was really surprising, we had some retailers in our study who say there is no change between Thanksgiving and Christmas because we're a retailer. Turns out all of them broke their no changes rule for Log4j, and the first time they did it was easy. Management was aware of the issue because there were a lot of cues to action. They could say, yep, this is big, this is relevant, we're going to do this. The fourth Log4Shell variant that came out, management was like, haven't we already dealt with this? And so dealing with that, and we didn't know this at the time, but you go back, you look at things, there's not a lot of pages that clearly said, this Log4Shell one is different than this one, right? The page that the team at CISA was assembling talked about products being vulnerable, but at least and I haven't looked at this page in years, hopefully they've improved this. There was a list of products, what versions were vulnerable, but it didn't say this was CVE 44288, this was 289, this was, and the numbers weren't sequential, but it didn't say vulnerable to these different CVEs or vulnerable to these variants in a way that made it easy for people to go and pick these up and deal with them. And so we can use ideas from public health, like this belief model, to help us understand what's going on in our world. And I think that sort of thing is going to be a really important part of how I help the field develop over the next few years.
It's beautiful. That's excellent. I love to hear that. And now that we're talking about these types of models and stuff, and you've mentioned creating like the entire CVE so that way vulnerability companies could then like use one specific standard. Is there a reason why, and maybe there is one, but I don't know that there is, that like there's for malware itself, there's not a specific type of one that all these antivirus or endpoint companies are utilizing their own type of ID systems for these?
The economic value that we get from CVE is that it creates a way for operations teams and security teams to talk to each other. The value today that we get from being able to say this piece of malware that you got, this piece of malware that I got were the same is smaller. And so convincing the anti-malware companies to spend time and energy on that, what does same mean? Right? When you have polymorphic malware, how do you decide that this and that are the same thing?
I knew that we were gonna go there. I'm like, when all the sums are completely different.
Yeah.
And so the families are so close in version control that it's like, how do you determine this? Then you have the whole new standards, I suppose.
Yeah. And so there have been efforts, but there hasn't been a benefit that is great enough. And it is so important to have that clearly defined benefit. We didn't even know, right? I told you my CVE story. I did not mention this as part of that, right? The benefit to us was this. Turns out there were benefits to industry as well that made it worth doing and makes it worth continuing even today. Malware, maybe someone will find a way to do that, either bring the cost down or bring the value up, either of which can lead to something new emerging.
Okay. What was the value added for you guys when you guys did the CVE release to Meter?
Competition, right? We could say our competition is not finding as many things as they're telling you that they're finding.
Got it. But that's only if they start using that type of system, if they use the Meter system. If they use their own system, then I guess you just say like, well, who knows how much they're actually finding would be the argument against that?
I mean, we didn't quite get there, but we said we're standards compliant and they're not.
Okay, beautiful. Go ahead. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Great, but I want to give you a chance to do a wrap or two, but
yeah. We'll do if you don't mind, can we close? Can I have one more question? We'll close in like 2 minutes.
No, I'm flagging it for you. I'm not saying I have to get off the phone.
Okay, I appreciate it. So the last question that I usually like to ask my guests is like, do you have any books that you would recommend, other things that inspired you or brought you into an entrepreneur journey? Cybersecurity books are great as well, or any books of psychology or things that you've gravitated towards recently, any types of books.
It's tempting to recommend my own books, and I'm going to ask you to do that, and I'm going to give you books. I'm going to give you other books here, and I'm going to look over at my bookshelf for a minute.
Yeah, please.
You can cut this part while I think
about
it. So two. Okay.
Yes.
So having looked at my bookshelf, and we're going to do the Scooby-Doo. Having looked at my bookshelf, there's two books that I think are worth everyone's time, whether or not you're at a startup or at a big company. The first is What Management Is. And this is a really small little book that explains why managers behave the way they do. And I found it very revelatory. It's very well thought out. And it starts We have management because sometimes we have projects that one person can't do on their own. So how do you do that? How do you achieve that? The other book that I want to recommend is a book called Leading Change. And by the way, I tend to hate business books. I find they're full of platitudes and nonsense. They're not well thought out. So Leading Change is all about what's involved in making change happen in a large organization or even a small organization, because people hate change. And the author talks about this in a very direct, clear, thoughtful way. The third book I want to recommend is one called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And the author, again, it's a business book, but the author says most business strategy is a load of BS. It's on the order of, we're going to work harder. Okay, well, you're going to work harder. The other guy's going to work harder. Now everybody's working harder. Where do you get advantage? So, for example, my little training company, where do we get advantage? We get advantage because I've written the books, and we get advantage because I think about how to deliver useful training. Other people can write books, but most of the people we compete with have not. And so that creates a sustainable advantage for us. And so a lot of what we do is focused around authorship, focused around other long-form writing like white papers, even though people like videos. From a strategic perspective, Adam writes, I believe, I hope, good stuff, longer stuff, fun stuff. The threats what every engineer should learn from a Star Wars book is both, I hope, useful and fun as writing. And so when I think about that, when I think about a business strategy, leveraging those strengths as part of a strategy that's an actual strategy versus we're going to work smarter or whatever it is. And I learned that by reading this book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. So that's 3 for you. What Management Is, Leading Change, and A Good Strategy, Bad Strategy.
Okay, excellent. We love some great books on this podcast, so I'll be sure to put those in the notes section as well. Last question. I know I said that was my last one, but I thought of one immediately after. So the other one that I want to start asking is, like, do you have any guests that you would recommend that appear on the show with maybe somebody I should reach out to share with the audience?
Yeah. So a lady by the name of Heidi Trost just published her first book called Human-Centered Security. I met Heidi when she invited me to her podcast because there's a chapter on usability in my threat modeling book. And so she saw that, and she was like, and she's working at the intersection of usability and security. And so she invited me, and we got talking a bit, and I'm honored to have written the foreword for her book, but she's also a great person. She's got a new book to talk about, so I would recommend her book, and I didn't list it in my 3 because I didn't feel like, I wrote the foreword was a good part of that answer. I was a little hesitant to do that, but you've given me a great opportunity to plug her book.
Okay. Excellent. I'll reach out to her and see if we can't get her on in other episodes. Adam, thank you so much for your time, all of your insights and your wisdom that you've shared with the audience and myself. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Like, one of my jobs, I actually took we were doing, I had to associate all vulnerabilities with devices on hospital networks. So it was my job to keep an updated copy of the NVD database. So that way we can do that. So, thanks to you and your work, you made those possible. So just want to say thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and being a part of the show.
You're welcome. And thank you. This was, I will say this was a little longer than my typical interview. But you've gone into some really fun places, and it's been a fun trip down memory lane for me, so thank you. This has been great.
Great. I'm glad we had a wonderful time. So I'll let you know when the episode's published, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your holidays.
Thank you. You too.